They laughed when she saved an empty glasshouse. She was 31 years old, a widow with flour dust still worked into the creases of her knuckles, standing in the middle of a dying Colorado town with $11.40 to her name, and she spent 9 of those dollars on a ruin that hadn't held a living plant in more than a decade. The man who sold it to her, a county clerk named Aldous Pruitt, could barely keep the smirk from his face as he stamped the deed. The women on Larimer Street watched her walk toward that vine-choked wreck of iron and glass and shook their heads the way people do when they've already written the ending of someone else's story. What they could not see, what none of them could see, was what rested behind the thickest curtain of ivy on the north wall, sealed inside a cavity that the original builder had mortared shut and painted over before he vanished from history entirely. What lay there would not merely change one woman's life. It would return to an entire valley what had been quietly stolen from it, name by name, acre by acre, year by year. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Voss. If you have ever stood in a place the world decided to forget, tell us about it in the comments. We read every one. Nora Voss was born in 1861 in the river-bottom farmland of western Missouri, the second of 4 children raised by a father who grew tobacco and a mother who grew everything else. Elspeth Voss, her mother, was a woman of extraordinary patience with the natural world. She kept a kitchen garden that neighbors 2 miles distant would stop to admire from the road, not because it was decorative, though it was beautiful in the way that purposeful things become beautiful, but because it produced through drought and late frost and early blight with a consistency that seemed almost willful. Elspeth had learned glasshouse cultivation from her own mother, who had come over from Baden-Baden with a trunk full of seed packets and a hand-copied notebook of horticultural observations that read, to the uninitiated, like a kind of scripture. The notebook listed germination temperatures, companion plantings, the precise angle of winter light that would coax a tomato seedling into its second true leaves. Nora spent her childhood in the amber warmth of that small attached glasshouse her father built onto the south side of the barn, learning to read the color of a leaf the way other children learned to read words on a page. Her father, Wendell, was a quiet man who expressed affection through instruction. He taught Nora to keep accounts, not because he expected her to run a business, it was 1873 and no one expected that, but because he believed a person who could not reckon their own worth in numbers was a person too easily cheated. He sat with her at the kitchen table on winter evenings with a ledger and a stub of pencil and walked her through the arithmetic of the farm, what a bushel brought at market, what seed and labor cost, what the margin was, and what it meant when the margin narrowed. He was not a suspicious man, but he was a precise one, and he gave his daughter a precision that would, much later, prove to be the most important gift she ever received. She married at 20. His name was Carl Voss. She had taken his name, though she sometimes joked that she'd really only traded one set of vowels for another, since her maiden name had also been 4 letters ending in a soft consonant. Carl was a carpenter from Salida, Colorado, where his family had settled after the silver mines drew everyone westward in the early 1880s. He was a gentle, capable man who built furniture with the same care that Nora's mother had grown plants, slowly, attentively, as though the wood had opinions he was obliged to consult. They settled in Harlow, a small agricultural town in the wet mountain valley south of Salida, where Carl built them a house and Nora started a small kitchen garden operation, selling seedlings and cuttings to the homesteads scattered across the valley floor. She was good at it. She was better than good. She had her mother's eye for the logic of growing things and her father's eye for the logic of numbers, and she kept a ledger of her own that tracked not only her costs and revenues but the germination rates of different seed stocks across different seasons, the soil temperatures that corresponded to particular yields, the names and preferences of every customer she served. Mrs. Halloran on the East Bench liked the small sweet peppers. The Lindqvist family, who ran sheep on the upper plateau, always wanted the hardy brassicas that could take a late May frost without complaint. Nora knew them all. She was building something real in Harlow, something that had roots. Carl died in the spring of 1889, when Nora was 28. He was framing a 2-story storefront on the main block of Harlow when a section of scaffolding failed, a failure traced afterward to a contractor named Silas Beaumont, who had used green lumber for the crossmembers to save himself the cost of kiln-dried stock. There was no legal remedy, or rather there was no legal remedy that a widow without land title could practically pursue in Fremont County in 1889. Carl had not yet filed the deed to their house in his own name, having trusted Beaumont's word that the paperwork would be handled as part of the construction contract, a trust that was, in hindsight, a catastrophic miscalculation. When Beaumont's lawyer appeared at Nora's door 6 weeks after the funeral, she learned that the house she had lived in for 7 years, the house Carl had built plank by plank with his own hands, sat on a lot that Beaumont claimed as his own through a chain of title that Nora could not afford to contest in court. She had her seedling stock, her tools, her mother's notebook, her father's ledger habits, and approximately $11.40. She had the clothes she was wearing and a carpetbag she packed in the 2 hours Beaumont's man gave her before the constable arrived to formalize the eviction. She had the grief that sat in her chest like a stone that would not dissolve no matter how much water she put on it. And she had the particular, iron-cold clarity that sometimes comes to people who have lost everything that was soft about their situation and are left standing on the hard floor of who they actually are. She stood on Larimer Street in the center of Harlow and looked at the thing that everyone else had looked past for 11 years. The Glasshouse had been built in 1876 by a botanist named Erasmus Fell, who had come to the valley from Philadelphia with grand ideas about cultivating exotic specimens for Eastern collectors and a commercial orchid operation that would, he believed, make him wealthy and Harlow famous. He had spent 3 years building the structure, a long, elegant iron and glass conservatory, 40 feet wide and nearly 80 feet long, with a curved ridge ventilator and a foundation of local sandstone that was, by any structural measure, more serious than anything else in Harlow. Then Fell had simply gone. No one knew exactly why. There were rumors, a financial collapse, a family emergency back east, a woman, a scandal, and the rumors, as rumors do, had hardened over time into a kind of settled mythology that no one bothered to verify. The town had absorbed the Glasshouse into its background, the way towns absorb ruins, treating it as a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a thing that had once had a purpose. By 1892, when Nora stood looking at it, the iron frame had gone to a deep orange rust in places, and the ivy, a particularly aggressive Virginia creeper that someone had planted along the north wall, perhaps Fell himself, perhaps a later tenant, had grown so thick and so high that the glass panels behind it were completely invisible. Several panes on the south face had cracked and been replaced at some point with boards. The interior was dark and smelled of rot and old soil and the particular mineral damp of a space that has been closed for longer than it was ever meant to be closed. The sandstone foundation, however, was solid. The iron frame, beneath its rust, was solid. The glass that remained was intact. The bones of the thing were good. Aldous Pruitt, the county clerk, had the deed in a file that had been gathering dust since 1879, when Fell had paid his property taxes for the last time and then apparently vanished. The county had been trying, without much effort, to sell the parcel for years. $9 was what Pruitt quoted her, and she suspected he would have taken 6, but she did not negotiate because she did not want to give him time to reconsider or to realize that she was serious. She counted out $9 in small bills and coins, and Pruitt stamped the deed with the air of a man doing a favor for a stray dog, and Nora walked out of the county offices with the title to the largest glasshouse in Fremont County folded in her coat pocket. The laughter began almost immediately. Not cruel laughter, mostly, but the particular laughter of a community that has watched someone make what it perceives as an obvious mistake. Nora heard it in the dry goods store and across the fence of the livery. She heard it in the way Mrs. Calloway, whose husband ran the bank, smiled at her with too much sympathy. She did not mind the laughter, or she minded it the way you mind a cold wind. It was unpleasant, but it told you which direction things were blowing, and that was useful information. She began cleaning the glasshouse the next morning with a borrowed broom and a bucket of water from the town pump. She worked from the inside out, clearing the decades of dead plant matter and bird debris from the floor, sweeping the glass panels clean of the algae and mineral deposits that had accumulated on their inner faces. She worked methodically, section by section, the way her father had taught her to work through a difficult arithmetic problem, not looking at the whole of it, which was overwhelming, but at the piece directly in front of her. She had been at it for 3 days when she reached the north wall. The ivy on the north wall was not merely decorative. It was structural, in the way that invasive things become structural when they are left long enough. The stems at the base were as thick as her wrist, and they had worked their tendrils into the mortar between the iron frame and the sandstone foundation in a way that made them genuinely load-bearing in places. She worked carefully, pulling the smaller stems first, working toward the larger ones, trying to understand the architecture of the vine before she dismantled it. And it was in the process of this careful dismantling, on the 4th day, with afternoon light coming at a low angle through the clean south-facing glass and illuminating the north wall for the first time in perhaps a decade, that she noticed the anomaly. Behind the thickest cluster of ivy, at roughly chest height, there was a section of the sandstone foundation wall that was slightly different in color from the surrounding stone, lighter, as though the mortar there was newer, or as though the stones themselves had been placed at a different time. The section was perhaps 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, and when Nora pressed her hand against it, she felt, very faintly, the particular hollow resonance of a cavity behind a wall rather than solid earth. She stood very still for a moment, her hand flat against the cool stone, and listened to her own breathing. She went to the livery and borrowed a small pry bar. She worked at the mortar for the better part of an afternoon, and what she found behind those stones was a cavity roughly the size of a traveling trunk, lined on 3 sides with fitted sandstone and on the 4th, the inner face, with a panel of lead sheeting that had been soldered shut. The lead panel was intact. Whatever was inside had been sealed against moisture with considerable care and considerable intention. It took her another hour to open the lead panel without destroying it, working a thin blade around the soldered edges until the seal gave way. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and then in a second layer of waxed canvas, were 3 objects: a leather-bound ledger, a packet of documents tied with a linen ribbon, and a glass case containing 24 seed packets, each labeled in a precise, angular hand, and each sealed with a wax that had held its integrity perfectly in the dry, lead-sealed dark. She sat on the floor of the glasshouse with those 3 objects in her lap and did not move for a long time. The ledger was Erasmus Fell's, that much was clear from the first page, which bore his name and the date 1876 in the same angular hand as the seed packets. But it was not a botanical ledger. It was an account book, and what it accounted for was something that made Nora's hands go cold even in the afternoon warmth of the glasshouse. Fell had been, it emerged page by careful page, a kind of informal land agent for the valley, not officially, but practically, in the way that educated men with legal knowledge sometimes make themselves indispensable to communities that lack lawyers. He had helped families file their land claims, helped them navigate the paperwork of the Homestead Act, helped them understand the surveys. And he had kept, in this ledger, a meticulous record of every parcel he had assisted with, the original claimant's name, the acreage, the survey description, the date of filing, and, in a column on the right side of each entry that made Nora's stomach tighten as she read it, the name of the person who currently held title to that parcel, and the date on which that title had been transferred. Many of those transfers had happened in 1879 and 1880. Many of them bore the same name in the current holder column. That name was Silas Beaumont. The packet of documents was the evidence. Fell, it was clear, had discovered what Beaumont was doing, had been quietly, systematically acquiring the land claims of valley homesteaders through a combination of fraudulent paperwork, forged transfer signatures, and the exploitation of families who did not read English well enough to understand what they were signing. Fell had gathered affidavits. He had gathered original survey documents. He had gathered, in several cases, the actual signed land warrants that proved the transfer signatures were forgeries because they bore dates that were impossible. One transfer was dated 3 weeks after the original claimant had died, with the claimant's signature appearing on the document nonetheless. Fell had been building a legal case. He had sealed the evidence here, in the wall of his glasshouse, presumably because he was afraid of Beaumont, who by 1879 was already a substantial man in the valley, already the kind of man who had lawyers and constables available to him. And then Fell had gone, and the evidence had stayed, sealed in the dark, for 13 years. Nora sat on the floor of the glasshouse with the afternoon light moving across the clean glass above her and read every page of the ledger and every document in the packet twice. Her father's voice was in her head as she read, not speaking to her, exactly, but present in the way that a well-learned habit is present, a quiet underlining of what mattered. She understood what she was reading. She understood what it meant. And she understood, with a precision that felt almost like calm, what she was going to do with it. But the doing of it would not be simple, and she knew that too. She began with the Lindqvist family, whose sheep ranch on the Upper Plateau appeared in Fell's ledger as one of the earliest fraudulent transfers. 320 acres of good grass that had been in Oscar Lindqvist's name until 1879 and had been in Beaumont's name ever since, with Lindqvist continuing to pay Beaumont a grazing lease on his own land without ever knowing it. She walked up to the Lindqvist place on a Sunday morning and sat at their kitchen table with the ledger open and her finger on the relevant entry, and she watched Oscar Lindqvist's face go through the full geography of disbelief, then recognition, then a fury so pure and quiet that it was almost like watching a man pray. Word moved through the valley the way water moves through dry soil, faster than you expect, and deeper. By the end of the following week, Nora had spoken with 7 families whose names appeared in the ledger. By the end of the week after that, there were 14, and 2 of them had sons who had studied law in Denver and came back to Harlow with a very particular expression on their faces when they reviewed the documents. This was when Beaumont became aware of what was happening. He came to the Glasshouse himself, which told you something about how seriously he was taking it, because Silas Beaumont was not a man who went to places, places came to him. He was a large, well-dressed man in his 50s, silver-haired, with the manner of someone who had been important for long enough that he had forgotten what it felt like not to be. He stood in the doorway of the glasshouse and looked at Nora, who was transplanting seedlings at a long work table she had built from salvaged lumber, and he spoke to her in the tone of a man offering generosity. He said that there had clearly been some confusion about certain old paperwork, and that he would be happy to compensate her for the documents she had found, compensate her generously, and that it would be a shame, really a shame, if a woman who was just getting back on her feet found herself tangled up in something complicated and legal and expensive. He said he had friends at the county offices. He said the deeds she was looking at were properly registered and had been for years. He said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that a glasshouse was a fragile thing. Nora set down the seedling she was holding and looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She told him that the original documents were no longer in the glasshouse, which was true. She had moved them to the care of the minister's wife, Mrs. Adeline Pruitt, who was the most trusted woman in Harlow and who had locked them in the iron box beneath the floorboards of the church vestibule. She told him that 3 copies had been made and were in 3 different locations. She told him that 2 lawyers from Denver were already reviewing the affidavits. She told him that she had also found, in Fell's ledger, the entry for the parcel on which her late husband Carl had been building the storefront when the scaffolding failed, the parcel that Beaumont had claimed as his own through exactly the same mechanism he had used on the Valley homesteads. She told him all of this in the same tone her father had used when explaining arithmetic, not angry, not triumphant, simply precise. Beaumont left without speaking again. The smile had gone entirely. What followed was not a dramatic legal battle, though it was a legal process. The Denver lawyers filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Office in the autumn of 1892, attaching Fell's ledger and the affidavits as exhibits. The Land Office, which had its own reasons to be interested in systematic fraud of this kind, moved with unusual speed. By the following spring, 12 of the 14 fraudulent transfers identified in the ledger had been reversed through a combination of court orders and negotiated resettlements. Beaumont did not go to prison. The law in 1893 was not well equipped to put men like Beaumont in prison, and the lawyers were honest enough to tell the families so from the beginning, but he was required to restore the land titles, to pay back 13 years of lease payments that had been collected under fraudulent pretense, and to surrender the Harlow Main Street parcel, which was returned to the estate of Carl Voss and therefore, by inheritance, to Nora. The quiet justice of it was this: Silas Beaumont, who had built his position in the valley on the accumulated weight of other people's labor and land, left Harlow in the summer of 1893 with considerably less than he had arrived with. And he left not in disgrace exactly, but in the particular silence that falls around a man when a community has collectively decided it no longer needs to pretend to respect him. Nora did not use the Main Street parcel to build a house for herself. She used it to build a seed exchange and Glasshouse nursery, a proper commercial operation, with a storefront on the street and a production house behind it connected to the old Fell Glasshouse, which she had by then fully restored. Every pane of glass cleaned or replaced, the iron frame treated and painted, the sandstone foundation repointed, the interior fitted with long work tables and a heating system of cast iron pipes that kept the temperature above 40 degrees even in January. She named it the Fell Nursery, because it seemed right to give the man his credit, even though he was gone and might never know it. The seed packets from the lead-sealed cavity turned out to be extraordinary. Fell had been, as his reputation suggested, a serious botanist, and the seeds he had preserved were varieties that had largely disappeared from commercial cultivation: a scarlet runner bean of unusual size and sweetness, a winter squash with a keeping quality so exceptional that it could sit in a root cellar until April without losing flavor, a tomato that ripened in the short Colorado season with a reliability that the standard varieties could not match. Nora grew them out carefully over 2 seasons, selecting for the best specimens, building her stock, and then she shared them freely to any Valley family that wanted them, because that was what her mother would have done, and because the Valley had been taking from itself long enough that it needed, she felt, a season of giving back. The Lindqvist family sent her a leg of lamb that first Christmas, wrapped in paper and tied with a blue ribbon. The Halloran boy, who was 12, began coming to the nursery on Saturday mornings to help with the potting, and Nora taught him what her mother had taught her about reading the color of a leaf. Mrs. Pruitt, the minister's wife who had kept the documents safe in the church vestibule, became a regular at the seed exchange and eventually, improbably, one of the best gardeners in the Valley, with a particular gift for the winter squash that Fell had preserved. The Glasshouse on Larimer Street, which had been a ruin and a joke and a symbol of everything that had been abandoned in Harlow, became instead a kind of center, a warm, glass-walled room where things grew in January, where neighbors came to buy seedlings and stayed to talk, where the smell of good soil and growing things was available to anyone who needed it. We come back, now, to the woman standing on Larimer Street in the autumn of 1892, with $11.40 and a carpetbag and a grief that had not yet found its shape. We come back to the laughter, which was the sound of a community that had learned, through long practice, to see only what was obviously present, the rust, the broken panes, the impenetrable ivy, and not what was possible. We come back to Nora Voss, who had grown up in a glasshouse and therefore knew something that most people do not know about apparently dead things, that dormancy is not death, that a seed sealed in the dark is not a seed wasted, that the conditions for growth are sometimes preserved precisely because they have been sealed away from the forces that would have consumed them. She spent $9 on a ruin, and what she found inside it was not treasure in the way that word is usually meant. It was the record of a theft, and the evidence needed to undo it. It was the labor and vigilance of a man who had tried to protect his community and had hidden his work in the only place he trusted, behind the wall of the thing he had built with his own hands. It was a collection of seeds that carried, in their oilcloth wrappings, the careful selections of a man who believed the Valley deserved beauty and abundance and had worked to provide it. None of that was worth $9. All of it was worth everything. The laughter stopped. Not all at once, these things never stop all at once, but gradually, the way light comes into a glasshouse in the morning, first a suggestion, then a warmth, then the full clear fact of it, present and undeniable. And Nora Voss, who had arrived in Harlow with a carpetbag and a borrowed broom and the habits of mind her father and mother had given her, stayed in Harlow and grew things, and kept her ledger, and taught the Halloran boy to read a leaf, and never once, in all the years that followed, forgot what it had felt like to stand in front of a thing the whole world had decided was worthless and to see, with absolute clarity, that the world was wrong. Friends, thank you for spending this time with us in the wet mountain valley, with the rust and the ivy and the slow, patient work of a woman who refused to accept other people's endings. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it, someone who is standing in front of their own ruined glasshouse right now, wondering if it's worth the trouble. And before you go, we'd love to know, what is something the world wrote off as worthless that turned out to hold something remarkable, a place, an object, a skill, a person? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and your answers are always the best part of what we do here. New stories arrive every week, and we hope to see you for the next one. Until next time, stay close.